Today's Ancient DOS game is definitely an unusual one, though not an unknown one by any stretch, usually going by the name of Corncob 3D, but sometimes it's also referred to as Corncob Deluxe. The first thing which makes this game unusual, right off the bat, is that it's an independently developed shareware flight sim. The reason that's unusual is because flight simulation is a surprisingly challenging thing to program properly, so you never think that an accurate physics model would ever show up outside of a major company with a huge team of people working on it, especially given that part of the draw of a flight sim is the environment you're flying through, which again typically takes a lot of people working together to do it right, given the quantity of things involved in making that environment feel real to at least some extent. Well, Corncob here doesn't even have an environment per se, which is also unusual. I mean, it does some palette changes, but that's about it. But then the next hit of weirdness is that this is a flight sim, which takes place in an alternate universe in 1949, where World War II never happened, and thus instead of fighting other nations vying for supremacy, you're fighting aliens, with an unlimited supply of machine gun ammo, missiles, and bombs due to them regenerating. The funny thing though is that I've actually known about this game for quite some time, but it was one of those games I had a heck of a time trying to get a copy of back as a kid, and every time I thought I had gotten a copy of it, it didn't work properly. Which, looking back, was probably just bad luck in combination with modem unreliability, terrible shareware compilations, that sort of thing. But even now, despite being sent a disc, which seemed to be the registered version of the game, something still felt off about it, which led into this huge rabbit hole of version differences and such to try and sort out the mess, because, quite frankly, the entire internet has this all very screwed up. Though given what I've found out, I am not even remotely surprised. So, before we get to the game stats, let's set the record straight. The game was originally released independently as Corncob 3D as a full-featured shareware product, as in, the shareware and registered versions had the exact same features. Heck, they're the exact same executable. But the shareware version had a time limit as to how long you could play it for. To get rid of the time limit, you'd send in a code generated by your copy of the game, receive a counter code back, then would type in that counter code into your copy of the game, and there you go, registered game with no more time limits. And the original registration fee was $15. Moving forward through the versions though, the game's creator was continuing to refine the experience and was also developing a massive add-on pack, several times larger than the base game, known as the Other Worlds campaign. Now, once the newly refined version was ready, which also happened to be smaller than the original shareware release of the game, it was released as shareware the same as before, but this time without a time limit, while at the same time was also published through MVP Software as Corncob Deluxe, even though that release of the game still called itself Corncob 3D. Yeah, Corncob Deluxe is exactly the same as the later shareware versions of Corncob 3D, just put in small retail boxes like this one, or sold direct through MVP. Adding to the confusion though is that both the later release of Corncob 3D and the retail Corncob Deluxe release, which again are identical, both claim that you can register the game for $15 or spend $20 to get the massive Other Worlds expansion. Yet when you open up the order form included to make your purchase, the only thing listed on it available for purchase is the Other Worlds expansion. Okay, so to summarize, you first had the early versions of Corncob 3D, which were time-limited shareware, followed by the later shareware releases of Corncob 3D, which removed the time limit and were identical to the retail box releases of Corncob Deluxe, and then you had the Other Worlds expansion, which was only available by mail order, and this makes up the 3 different core releases of this game. I know it all seems kinda bonkers, but trust me, I spent way too much time trying to figure this all out. And heck, I'm not the only one who got confused by it. Scrolling back to when this was all happening, even some shareware vendors were getting confused, as there's at least one example out there of a shareware vendor going into the order form for the game and altering it to say the $20 fee was to get Corncob Deluxe, not realizing that Corncob Deluxe was just the retail name of the same game. Well, at least I managed to decipher all of that, but now I get to see how long it takes for the rest of the internet to get its facts straight. Corncob 3D was originally developed in 1991 by Kevin Stokes and George Welch, working together under the business banner of Pie-in-the-Sky Software, a name more remembered for the game engine they created in the mid-90s, which I really need to cover on the show at some point, although I don't believe they got this game released until the start of 1992, and the release of Corncob Deluxe through MVP Software didn't happen until 1994. And as we've already established, this is effectively a one-player combat flight simulator. The original release of the game uses two different video modes, the standard 80x25 text mode for menus with a very slightly altered character set to show star symbols and possibly other awards I don't know about, while the gameplay happens in a VGA 640x350 16-color mode. Now I know the 640x350 mode looks like it would work on EGA cards, but no, it does not, especially considering the kinds of palette alterations which occur during the normal course of gameplay. While another reason for choosing 640x350 over 640x480 would be because you're guaranteed to have enough memory for 2 video pages on a VGA card. Though I don't believe this game actually does any page flipping, given the kinds of flickering going on sometimes. A later release has also included some still photos and a title sequence done using the 320x200 256 color VGA mode. And as for audio, the game has a few PC speaker sound effects, but primarily features ad-lib sound effects and music. As for its current release state, the game was never made freeware as far as I can tell, but again, the latest shareware version is technically the full game, even though realistically speaking, the Otherworlds expansion sort of became the full game. It just wasn't referred to in that sense. The Corncob 3D itself can be downloaded from practically anywhere with DOS Game downloads, so I'll go ahead and recommend the usual standby of the DOS Games website at www.dosgames.com. But in terms of physical copies, I found practically nothing online for either Corncob Deluxe or the expansion, so it's clearly very rare to come across, and I have no idea what the price point would be if a copy did surface. When you first boot up the game, you have a couple options as to how to get started, as you can either run through the game's training mode, or create a character and run through pre-made campaigns and missions. The training mode is intentionally designed to be extremely difficult, but it also defaults you to having an invulnerable plane, just to give you a taste of how ridiculous things can get. Though you can absolutely reconfigure the settings so that pretty much nothing in the training mode is a threat, save for the flying saucer, since that's the only thing you can't turn off. The main gameplay, however, is handled by creating a pilot and running that pilot through various missions and various campaigns. You first select which campaign you want to partake in, then select a runway to take off from, which, at least in the final shareware release and deluxe release, only has one runway in each campaign. Then you're put on the runway and are tasked to complete mission objectives. Pressing F2 brings up a list of all of the missions for the campaign you're in, also indicating where they're located relative to your starting position. You're also allowed to automatically teleport to the mission area instead of having to fly there manually, though if you do decide to fly there manually, you have a time compression ability to pass time very quickly while holding the T key down. I suppose now's as good a time as any to point out why the game is named Corncob, since at first glance, that seems like a weird name for a flight sim. Well, the name is actually kind of a roundabout in terms of its reference. Since this game technically takes place in the late 40s, combat aircraft were very basic back then by today's standards, and the particular aircraft featured in this game is the F-4U Corsair, one of the most popular single-seat combat aircraft of the time. Or to be more precise, since that aircraft had a plethora of variants, the notable variant here is the F-2G, or Super Corsair as it was often called, which was built to test some new wing folding tech, along with a high-performance 28-cylinder engine, which was known as the Corncob due to the radial pattern its cylinders were arranged in. In fact, this game features what's referred to as an emergency rocket booster, which can be used to provide a burst of speed for a short period of time. Now, the Super Corsair was actually kind of a failure in our reality, but the assumption is that in this alternate reality where aliens took over, the design fared way better and ultimately became the standard for facing down the alien invaders. Now, despite the look of the game, I will say that the flight model here is actually pretty darn accurate, even modeling wind effects surprisingly well. But it does have one notable exception to its accuracy: the rudder control. It's difficult to explain exactly what feels off about it, but it's almost like the changes it applies are temporary, as though it only adjusts the direction you're facing and not your actual flight trajectory. And I figured out later that it does have very tiny effects on your flight trajectory, but not nearly as much as I would expect. And yes, I am aware the rudder isn't supposed to have a huge effect on trajectory, but the effect it's supposed to have is definitely more than what this game's trying to get away with. The realism kinda goes right out the window with the combat aspect though. Since you're fighting aliens and presumably using some of their stolen tech, your plane is outfitted with 3 regenerative weapons: machine guns, missiles, and bombs. The ammo for all of these weapons is constantly regenerating, but the only one you actually have a display for are your bombs, as you can only have 3 bombs ready to drop at a time. Whereas machine gun ammo and missiles, you'll know you're running dry because they won't rapidly fire anymore, though the regeneration rate is pretty quick for machine gun ammo and not all that slow for the missiles either. Aiming is troublesome though, as you don't have an easy way of doing this. You have a crosshair for your guns and missiles, which definitely helps, but the missiles are dumbfire and are affected by gravity slightly, so it's almost an art form getting them to go where you want them to. Though I should point out that with the exception of primary targets and flying saucers, the missiles will pretty much one-shot anything. There's also 2 different ways you can fire your machine guns, either rapidly, alternating between the 2 of them with the spacebar, or holding left shift will produce a massive scatter of bullets extremely quickly, though I find there's rarely a good use for that particular feature. And as for bombs, it is really hard getting a bead on where to drop them. You have the ability to look down at an angle, but it doesn't give you any aiming cursors or anything to aid in where and when to drop the bombs. Plus, actually getting the view to pan down interferes with controlling the plane, thus you can't look down and control the plane at the same time, and you have to be spot on to hit things with the bombs. Close simply doesn't cut it. One thing I find interesting though is the sheer variety to the missions. With a lot of combat flight sims, the missions almost always come down to take off, destroy targets, return. Here in Corncob, some of the missions get a lot more creative. For instance, in this mission, the target you need to destroy is invulnerable to all forms of attack, save for one: a direct collision with your plane. Thus, the intended method to win the mission is to eject from your plane at the last possible moment, parachute to the ground, then escape to a safe distance to call for a rescue van to come and pick you up. Yeah, something I didn't mention just yet is that this flight sim also has controls in place for what happens to you after you eject from your plane. Now first, you need to press spacebar to survive the descent, since if you don't, you won't open your parachute and likely won't survive the fall. Then, once you're on the ground, you're still able to be killed by attacks and little alien vehicles moving around, thus you have a pistol with 20 rounds, as well as a device known as an assassin's bomb, which can be used to take out one structure of importance. Though my experience with planting and detonating these assassin's bombs is that they almost never do the job unless the mission is specifically structured for it to work. So that's kinda disappointing. Or heck, as another example of the game being incredibly weird and surreal, there's a mission where you have to rendezvous with someone who was covertly collecting data on an alien structure before blowing it to pieces. You have to land near the structure, exit your plane, find where the guy's hiding, wait for him to give you the thumbs up, even though that doesn't exactly look like a thumbs up, and then return home with the information he gives you. Doesn't sound so surreal, does it? Well, this structure happens to be up at 10,000 feet. Yeah, landing on an airstrip at 10,000 feet is definitely a weird experience. And even once I pulled it off, did some platforming to get to the structure, got the data and got back, now the question was, how do I get off this structure? I tried to turn around at taxiing speed, but ended up falling off the runway, so just hit the throttle and pulled up once my plane had enough speed from the fall. Once you clear one or more missions in a campaign, you're expected to return to base to make those efforts count towards your pilot's overall progress, though they'll only count if you have invulnerability turned off. Otherwise, the mission is treated just like a training mission and no progress is made. You can also gain ranks or get awards depending on what transpired. However, if your pilot dies or gets captured by the aliens, you have the option to resurrect the pilot, so you can keep playing as them. Like, the game doesn't force you to retire dead or MIA pilots, like a lot of other military sims do. That said, you don't have to actually land following the mission if you don't want to. As long as you're near a friendly base, you can quit and the game will proceed normally. But landing will get you bonus points, and landing low-speed aircraft isn't all that hard really. Well, with a proper joystick anyways. And because the game is emulating wind, and because the rudder doesn't work perfectly, it's actually very difficult to land the freaking thing on the runway. I mean, getting it on the ground is all easy enough, and thankfully that still counts. Yeah, that's one big complaint I have about this game, is that despite being a flight sim from the 90s, it does not have any advanced joystick support. Now, all it supports are basic 2-button joysticks, and only supports using one at a time, thus it's almost pointless trying to play the game with it. Now, the keyboard controls for this game are actually fairly decent, all things considered. Not perfect by any stretch, but they do the job for everything, except for landing properly. In fact, one thing the game does well is having built-in instructions to step you through all the gauges in the aircraft, as well as how a lot of different things work. So even if you're not accustomed to playing flight sims, you can actually get pretty far in here without those skills. At least with the invulnerability turned on, as one thing I failed to mention up until now is that this game is incredibly difficult. Some missions aren't so bad, but others are borderline impossible because of the sheer quantity of anti-aircraft guns and death ball launchers you have to dodge. Now, the anti-aircraft guns aren't the most accurate. As long as you're not flying in straight lines and at a decent altitude, you're going to have a tendency to miss. But the death balls are very tricky to deal with, as they come in a variety of colors, each of which has differing stats and capabilities, all of which are freaking relentless, chasing down your aircraft for minutes on end if they have to. Now, the only way to deal with death balls is to shoot them down, but that means getting them in front of you. They have very good lateral turning, but terrible pitch control, so the best way to dodge them is to hard pitch up or down when they get close so that they fly over or under you, then recover and line up your guns to shoot them out of the sky before they have a chance to swing around and try again. The last thing to quickly mention is that this game has some very egregious color cycling and flashing effects, which can get eye-searing when you're close to their source. I've been cutting around my captured footage to avoid the worst of it, but if that's something which you happen to be sensitive to, then this is not going to be a game you want to take a chance at playing. Overall, Corncob 3D, or Corncob Deluxe, is interesting. I'm not really sure I liked it, but then that's more so down to what it fails to do right and due to its high degree of difficulty. And that's more so personal preference than actual bad design. I mean, apart from the rudder controls not being as accurate as they could have been. But again, this is an independently developed flight sim. In and of itself, to pull it off with any level of accuracy is impressive. Thus, to that end, I feel this is more impressive in terms of the skills of the people involved in making it, rather than being impressive as a game compared to other games. Because compared to other combat flight sims, this does not hold up against them at all. But then, this was sold at a shareware price, so ultimately, you get exactly what you paid for. A budget combat flight sim which isn't perfect, but still does the job. So it's worth playing out of sake of curiosity, especially since you can get the full 12 missions in the original shareware and deluxe releases, but because of how it controls, you may find yourself yearning for better flight sims before too long. I tried to get the flickering to go away, but ultimately realized after watching some footage of the game on real hardware that it's not an emulation thing. Anytime the frame rate gets anywhere near normal, you get flickering. To eliminate the flickering entirely requires you to run the game slower than is comfortable. So I found a good balance between comfort and bearable flickering to be about 4,000 cycles. Now also, if you plan to use a joystick or gamepad, it doesn't require any extra configuration on the DOSBox side of things, but then this game also doesn't support any advanced joystick features, so you're going to be stuck with only 2 axes of control and only 2 buttons by default. So if you do decide to use a joystick or gamepad, you're probably going to want to turn button wrap off so you can assign all of your extra buttons to useful keyboard controls. Anywho, that'll be all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Next up, 2 Saturdays from now on July 1st, we're finally going to have the first ADG mod video of Season 7. And not only that, it's a mod video where we're finally going to be taking a look at an official expansion pack for a game that's been previously covered on the show. So make sure to stay tuned to see which DOS game has such an expansion pack that's worth talking about. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to all the people seen here supporting me on Patreon. If you'd like to join in with them and support the show directly, head on over to patreon.com/KASICK.